Welcome to our new member tasting. My name is Madeline Schmall and I'm your host for tonight. But during the day, you'll usually find me looking after our SMWS community on social media. Nothing beats a society whiskey with a beer chaser. So what better way to get to know each other than to team up with the Blair Athol-based Wasted Degrees Brewery? And our global brand ambassador, John McShane. I'll introduce you to them in just a second for a few drams and some society chat. But before I get to that, let's take a quick look at the running order. So first up, we'll have cask number G10.33, Coconut, and that will be paired with Wasted Degrees Helles Lager. Next up, it's cask number 5.81, a fruity prescription, which will pair with the Wasted Degrees Galaxy IPA, followed by cask number 112.90 Fruit Alloy, which we're also pairing with the Galaxy IPA from Wasted Degrees. Next up, it's cask 1.245, Pour It just around midnight, and that will be with the Kveik Session IPA, followed by cask number 24.153 Midsummer Night's Dream, paired with their stout. So due to the limited nature of our single cask whiskies, we're sadly not able to offer you the chance to purchase full bottles of the whiskies tonight. However, we have selected a few alternatives and we think you'll love them, and we'll share these in an email after the tasting. So this is the point to make sure you have your drams and your tasting mat ready. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to your ambassadors for tonight. So first up, we have Jack Lowe, who's the director of Wasted Degrees Brewing.
Hi, man.
Hey,
Thanks
Jack.
for having me.
Yeah, not at all. How are you doing tonight?
Really good, thank you. Yeah, been a hectic day in the brewery, but yeah, really rearing to go. Great to get fired into some amazing whiskey. So yeah, very happy to be here.
Great. We also have our global brand ambassador, John McShane, joining us.
Hi, Mads.
Hey,
Hi, Jack.
John.
Hi,
How you
John.
doing?
I'm doing fine, and I'm especially happy since we're getting kind of back to normal now, and you and I were actually able to see each other face to face and have a few drams last week, Mads. So that was good.
Yeah, it was really nice. It felt strangely like normality is slowly coming again. But yeah, so before we kick things off, John, I would love it if you could kind of do a wee intro to the society, because I think we have some new members joining us tonight, and it's always good to remember kind of where we started from.
Yes, I'd love to, Mads. We started in 1983. There was a man called Philip Hills, known as Pip Hills, who had managed to acquire a cask of single malt whiskey from a distillery in Speyside. And he brought it back and shared it with his friends, and they all took bottles of it away, and they loved it so much they sent him back to get another one. And when he came back down this time, the news had spread and more people wanted to join in and get a taste of this single malt whiskey. And eventually, Pip decided we better formalise this group of people, and the Scotch Malt Whisky Society was born at the Vaults. We were set up to bring our members very special, unique, one-off experiences in whisky. A single cask is going to taste differently from every other single cask. And Pip made it his ambition and the reality actually to get single casks from a host of Scotch distilleries. We're now up to 150 in total. We're 40 next year. We've even bought whiskey from other countries around the world and other spirits, but 95% of what we do is still single cask, single malt Scotch. We're the biggest members club in the world. Over 30 countries, 34,000 members, and we are all about special whiskey and people joining together to enjoy that whiskey together. So it's a society, and our members can enjoy meeting together, enjoy our whiskey in our venues, 2 in Edinburgh, 1 in London, 1 in Glasgow, opened 2 years ago, my hometown at last, and also around the world in our partner bars. There's partner bars in the home countries as well. So there are places to get together and join. You can get a lapel badge as a member. So that means you can identify somebody who you don't know who shares a similar passion to you. And before you know it, you've got another friend in your group. So I often say to people, and I don't know whether this is mine. I've said it for so long. I don't know whether I made it up or I got it from someone else. But our members come to the whiskey with flavour on their mind, and fun in their hearts. That's the society.
Ah, brilliant. Couldn't have said it better myself. So I'm glad you did. And I would say if anyone has any questions along the way about the society, about the whiskies we're drinking tonight, fire them in the comments. I can see there's lots of hellos coming in from Kansas, from Edinburgh. So let us know where you're tuning in from, which drams you're enjoying, which beer's your favorite. We'll ask you again at the end. And also, if you are a new member, make sure you have a wee read of your unfiltered and learn all about the society and what we have to offer. And with that, I think it's a really good point to move on to the first dram and give it a try. Do we want to do beer first or whiskey? I'm going to throw it out to you guys.
Now, can I just tell the people on tonight there's been a great tragedy. My package has not arrived. So I've only got the whiskies. I don't have those wonderful beers that Jack's company is making, but I know all about them. I got a big pack a few weeks ago and I enjoyed all of the different types I had. So I'm going to very jealously watch you enjoying your beer, your whiskey tonight. I've just got the whiskies and I might even have someone else's beer just so I'm not too green. But remember this, folks. For some people, remember, beer and whiskey go together well. A man called Compton Mackenzie, who wrote Whiskey Galore, said that a beer never tastes like itself unless it's chasing a good dram of whiskey down the gullet, preferably 2 drams. There you are.
Yeah, and I think that's a great introduction for you, Jack, to talk a bit about Wasted Degrees.
Well, I was going to say, John, unfortunately, as a nano brewery, we don't quite have the corporate helicopter that I could fly over to you to parachute some beer into your neck of the woods, but maybe someday. Maybe an electric-powered one, a wee bit more friendly to the environment. So yeah, as Matt said, I'm Jack from Wasted Degrees. So yeah, we're a brewery based in the small village of Blair Athol in the Highlands, just within the Cairngorms National Park boundary. On the go since 2017, and originally started up by my brother and his then business partner. Our quirky name, we often get questions about that. Is it related to some sort of brewing measurement or some such? It actually comes from my brother's background. He originally trained as a teacher, but as a keen kind of homebrew obsessive, that hobby eventually spiraled out of control and became a business that we now know as Wasted Degrees. So from teaching to brewing, as a brother, I was especially happy to get access to even more beer, which was fantastic as far as I'm concerned. So now, as a co-owner of the business, I find myself here with yourselves tonight. And Wasted Degrees is a really kind of environmentally conscious brewery. So we have an ultra low impact on the planet, and that's a core kind of component of how we operate, from the 100% Scottish grown malted barley that we use in our beers, and even on occasion when the weather permits, Scottish hops, which is a very seldom seen thing in brewing, especially given the lovely kind of weather we have in Scotland. So yeah, as I say, a relatively small brewery. We brew sort of 1,000-litre batches, so really quite niche. And much like the society, the focus is on flavour creation and kind of championing that flavour journey, both through the raw ingredients that go into the beer and the way that the beer is manufactured. So we tend only to ever brew our beers once, and once it's gone forever. So really, very much, I like the malt whiskey society. So get it whilst it's there, don't miss out, and participate. That's the key thing. So really delighted to be able to match some of our beers with the drams. And I should say, I'm not unfamiliar with SMWS. I have been a member for many years, well over a decade. In fact, for about 12, 13 years, I lived a couple of minutes walk from the vaults. So no doubt quite an envious position for most members, having such ready access to the vaults, which thankfully I haven't developed a drinking problem, but an appreciation more so. So I'm actually sat here with the first ever SMWS bottle that I got my hands on, which I think more for sentimental reasons I can't quite open. I'm sure I'll find a good enough excuse sometime, but nice old livery there. So it reminds me of my time in Leith, if nothing else. So yeah,
What's the number, Jack?
The number is 41.40, and the name is Beeswax, Candles and Pineapples.
One of my favourite distilleries.
So I'm sure we go very well with some of our beers tonight, but not tonight.
not tonight. We'll save that for another special occasion. I just want to shout out some of the comments that have come in the meantime. John, you've got one. Mabel from Hong Kong has joined us.
Yes, hi Mabel.
And we also... Sorry, go ahead.
It's just great to see Mabel's here with us, yes.
And we also have Ian, who's joining us from Darlington, and he owns Orb, Micropub, Ale and Whiskey House, so loves beer and whiskey. So Ian, cheers to you. Hope you enjoy the tasting.
That's a good reason for me to visit Darlington, Ian. I don't think I ever have, but now I will.
Excellent. Well, with all of that, let's kick off. Let's try the whiskey, and then let's try it with the beer. Does that sound good?
Excellent, yeah.
Now, this whiskey has been transferred by us. In the society, we're very, very keen to develop our own whiskey and the flavours that arise from it. So we will take new make spirit and we'll put it into our own wood, our own casks, and mature it in our own warehouse. And sometimes we will take the whiskey from one cask and move it into another cask to add a different layer of flavour. And this one, this single grain whiskey, has been moved into a heavy toast medium char cask, and the toasting and the charring almost do different things. The toasting creates more flavour, the charring takes some flavours that you don't want away. So this is should be a very well-rounded whiskey with some of the bourbon cask flavours that you would expect, the vanilla, the caramel and butterscotch perhaps, then some added flavours from the toasting and even more fruity, floral flavours from the charring. Let's try it. For any new member out there, we should also say that there are three things that we do not do to our whiskey. We do not add any artificial colouring. We do not do any chill filtering, which some distilleries do for an effect which takes away the potential haze when you add water or ice, and it's perfectly natural. And the other thing we don't do is dilute it before it goes into the bottle. So this is 61.6%, okay? So if you're new to single cask strength whiskey, give it a bit of a nose, a bit of a sip, swirl it in your mouth neat, but then think about adding a little water. Water doesn't only dilute the alcohol, it can change the flavours in the glass completely and give you a completely fresh experience.
I'm going to try this one with some water now. I have to admit, I tried this one earlier this year. I was lucky enough to, and I bought a bottle. So I tend to drink it neat, but I'm going to try it with some water now and see what flavours I get.
What I actually think is incredible about this is that it's one of those whiskies where even at 61.6%, it's just exploding with flavour, you know? And sometimes you're worried, if I add water, will that change it to its detriment? Well, the fact is, you don't know until you've tried. And if you've got a bottle at home, and in your first dram you add a little bit of water, and you don't like it with a little bit of water, drink the rest neat. It's up to you. Everyone is different.
I think the thing about this one is coconut really is very apt to its name, but it does take me to tropical places. I do think with this being a grain, there's almost kind of some rum influence, even though it's not a rum cask. There's kind of, it reminds me of sweeter rums. And I really enjoy that. I really think it needs a bit of time in the glass because even though it's fairly delicate, there are flavors that will reveal themselves over time.
Absolutely, yeah. The coconut really does shine through, and for me, I'm also getting things like slightly burnt toast with unsalted butter and sugar on top. So yes, it's quite kind of textural. It's definitely got a kind of caramel sauce element.
And those kind of flavours are bound to come from the toasting, Jack. Which is that's good. It's good that has occurred.
Great.
Well, I'm going to dive in and try it with the beer now, which is the Helles Lager. Jack, I don't know if you want to talk a bit about this pairing.
Happy to talk through that. So one of the things that stood out in the tasting notes of the dram was kind of notes of ice cream, some quite kind of sweet and vanilla-based comments in the tasting notes. So we felt that this sort of biscuity lager, a more kind of traditional style lager than you might find in the mainstream, say, would complement those flavors really well and add a freshness as well. Helles Lager kind of history behind that, a German style, as you might imagine. And the name really kind of comes from the kind of brightness of the beer, so hell and bright and light. So, a very easy drinking beer for me. Tasting notes from this one, I kind of equate it to almost like sort of liquefied digestive biscuits, quite a malty lager. So if you're unfamiliar with craft beer, I always recommend to people, start with a craft lager if you can, something in a kind of familiar territory. And I find, it's a real gateway beer style. If you're looking to either understand beer a bit more, if you're already familiar with craft, but also for the unconverted craft beer drinker in your life, this is a really good choice.
And it pairs beautifully with us.
You're making me very jealous, you two, enjoying that beer.
Your time will come soon enough, John. We've got a wee question for you from Ian. I heard to leave it a minute for every year in the glass before drinking. Is this right?
Ian, a great point, and I've heard it so many times. And during your whiskey journey, Ian, you will find lots of things being said about how you should or shouldn't drink whiskey. And I've heard that one many times. Personally, it's not something that I employ as a practice in my drinking. I mean, I've also heard it said, for example, mainly by Richard Patterson, who you may have heard of. He said that you should hold it in your mouth for 1 second for every year of its maturity. And that starts to get a bit difficult after 40-year matured whiskey, But I know what you mean. What I would suggest that you do, honestly, just to try the theory out, when you're pouring a glass of whiskey for yourself at home, pour 2 glasses of the same whiskey and just push one away and let it sit there while you're enjoying the first one. Enjoy the first one neat, a little bit of water, savor it, take your time, take notes about the tasting if you want, or just keep it in your head, and then go back to the one which is sat there for however long it has been and see if you think there's been any changes, and that will help you decide whether it's something you want to try in the years ahead.
I think as well, that's a really good point, John, and one that goes for this tasting as well. And that is, don't feel that as we go through the drams that you need to drink all the drams or all the beers at once. I can't speak to the beer because I'm not quite as well versed, but certainly with the whiskey, it will taste different throughout the night as it sits in the glass, but also as you've tried other whiskies. So even if it's not initially your cup of tea, come back to it, and you may have different feelings at the end of the night, and it may become your top dram. So give it a go, see what happens.
I also want to maybe bring to your attention the fact that, like Scotch whiskey's been around for a couple of 100 years. And in 1983, when the Scotch Malt Whisky Society started, we were absolutely out there in the lead in terms of bottling single cask, single malt whiskey. There was hardly any single malt whiskey back then, never mind single cask, single malt whiskey. Now, we're 40 years of age next year, and we're still leading that charge. We've developed many different things over the years, but we're not finished yet, and there'll be more and more and more. And I want to give you a little example relating to this particular whisky. Our founder, Pip, many years ago, before our members magazine was called Unfiltered, it was just a newsletter to members every month. And in it, Pip used to answer members' questions, right? Now, way back in the late 80s, early 90s, Pip answered a question from a member in the newsletter, and he said, "Thank you, Mr. McCallum from Stirling. You've asked why don't we bottle single grain whisky? Well, the reason we don't bottle single grain whisky is the same reason that we don't bottle bleach, right? So single grain whisky way back 20, 30 years ago wasn't regarded as something other than for blends, and how that has changed. And I was speaking to Pip last week at dinner in the vaults, and he agrees that tastes have changed, ideas have changed too, and the society will be on a never-ending journey, actually, exploring different casks and how we work with them and extra maturation. Some people in the whisky don't like extra maturation. They don't think we should do that. We think we should stick with a single cask and that should be it. That's their point of view. All we're saying is that our exploration of extra maturation in different casks is all about giving our members the widest choice and experience of flavour that we can. And you watch over the next few years the things that you're going to be able to try and enjoy.
Amen. No, I think that's the thing about the society. I kind of drank a little bit of rum when I joined the society, but I wasn't a huge fan. And then I tried one of our single cask rums, and I was like, wow, okay, maybe I like rum now. And I think, you know, some of our single casks as well that aren't whiskey, our rums, our armagnacs, our cognacs, even our bourbons are they're worth exploring as well. So make sure you do. Jack, we had a wee question for you as well about Taproom online shop.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So the brewery we have an online store, and you'll find out more information about how we operate as a business, and contributes to our local community as well. So that's at wasteddegrees.com. You'll also find us on the usual Instagram, Facebook, Twitter accounts too. Taproom, we much like SMWS and venues, we like to bring our drinkers as close to the beer as we possibly can. So that is literally getting people into the brewery. We're open year round, but our taproom, we have a number of pizza ovens and barbecues and smokers to bring people in to make a journey, make a trip out of it. But really, as kind of brewers, it gives us an opportunity to help people get as close to the production and then see the people and the hardware that make the beer, but also enjoy the product at its most kind of fresh point in its life. And so one thing we do, which I suppose is quite an alien thing in whiskey, we obviously put expiry dates on beer, and we do things between 6 to 12 months because we understand how the beer behaves in its packaging, and we want that to be tasted in its freshest capacity as a product to make sure that people enjoy it. And as I say earlier on, it's one of the reasons that we choose to continuously create different beers, because it's interesting for us as a brewery, but likewise for people to enjoy and to almost kind of enjoy the challenge of pairing different drinks together. And what I think is really interesting, Mads, this evening is comparing these two drinks, depending on which order you have, the beer, the whiskey, or vice versa. They bring out different things in each other. Almost kind of cleanses or enhances the palate somehow. So yeah, I find that really interesting.
Yeah, the relationship between beer and whiskey is so symbiotic anyway, but I find that there are beers, especially IPAs, which I still can find difficult at times, that when paired with whiskey, I find a lot more approachable. So I think you've got a wee question there from Ian as well.
So yeah, I mean, it's a terrible brand message for me to say, but I completely buck the trend. My degree's in marketing, so unfortunately, I'm using my degree. Fortunately, unfortunately, pays the bills, right? So yeah. Thanks for your question, Ian.
Well, I think we'll take Boko's comment. Loves grain whiskey, even though it gets such a bad rep. Bubblegum notes that go with a good grain, and it's easier on the pocket than a single malt.
I'll tell you something, Boko. I was kind of in that category as well. I was a bit like Pip. It took me a while to actually adapt to grain whiskey and the different flavours. And I've got a member in London who I'm very friendly with, who's huge on grain whiskey. He loves his grain whiskey. And I used to sort of debate with him whether it was as good as malt and that kind of thing. But when I drink that tonight, that one, I just think, wow, it's only 15 years old. Grain is often a lot older. Fantastic. That's so beautiful, that. And if there was a bottle of it, I think I'd be buying one.
I think what makes this one interesting for me as well is that, you know, unlike from the brewery side, really once you make a beer, unless you're going to somehow barrel age it, the production process is really quite linear, and it stops at a point. Whereas with the whiskey, and I think this dram's a great example, is that I guess SMWS as a whiskey maker is stewarding that journey. So if I remember correctly, just in the tasting notes, it was in one cask for 11 years of its life, and then there's obviously been a decision at a point in time to help that journey of flavour creation. Is that right?
And people think, Jack, that we've done quite a lot of extra maturation in recent years, and people think it is a new thing for us. It's not. We did our first extra maturation cask in 1991. Certainly, the idea of extra maturation is accelerated in the last few years. It's not all of our casks by any stretch of the imagination, but we've done a bit more in recent years. And guess what? We listen to what our members tell us. And many of our members ask us to try this and to try that. And if we tried this and that kind of cask, we love to listen to those and see if we can give what we've been asked for.
And while we're on the subject of casks, HTMC Hogshead, so heavy toast, medium char. John, do you want to tell us a bit more about that cask type and what it involves?
Yeah, sure. Heavy toast means that we have burnt the inside of the cask, but not to the extent it's gone on fire. And the heavy toast will burn some of the elements of the wood to create more flavour, the lignins and the hemicellulose and that kind of thing. The wood materials that can be burnt to create more flavour compounds. And then the charring is actually done to take away, because we're creating a carbon skeleton, as it were, some of the flavours that you don't want, some of the some of the immature flavours, particularly some of the sulphurous ones, can be taken away and withdrawn into the wood and away from the spirit by the charring. So the toasting and the charring are almost working alongside each other, but to opposite effect, to create more flavour and take away the flavours you don't want. You know, it was a methodology really kind of developed, I believe, by Dr. Jim Swan.
So it was.
Who unfortunately is no longer with us, but he was a huge name in the whiskey industry and helped many distilleries start from scratch and follow a particular pattern in terms of flavour. And Jim Swan kind of developed that particular thing. And that's interesting because it demonstrates that we're never finished. We're learning more all the time, you know. And the society will be at the forefront of these new developments. We can't stop and say, that's it. We've got to the edge of the flavour journey.
No, absolutely. And I think while we're talking about flavour journeys, it's probably a good time to move on to the next dram. Before we do, for anyone who's wanting to look at the tasting notes or know a bit more about regions or cask types, you'll have these wee cards in your tasting pack, and they have all the details of each dram. So you can go and refer to them for any extra information, or you can ask and we'll also have it. And
please, if there's anything on the card that you don't understand, just shout out and we'll happily talk you through it. If you want to know about flavour profiles or that kind of thing, there's 12 flavour profiles in the society by which we try to distinguish for our members which bottling fits a particular profile in case there's one which a member enjoys better than others.
Great. Well, on that note, on to cask number 5.81, which is a fruity prescription. And this one, for anyone who's got the beer, is paired with a Galaxy IPA. And it's from our spicy and sweet flavor profile. I think now might also be a really great time to talk a bit about our tasting panel and also adding water, which I know we've spoken about briefly. But our tasting panel, it's a large mix of individuals. They will try all of our whiskies, and it's up to them to decide if they're bottled or not. So it's in their hands, really. John might have a bit more insight on that as well.
Just mad. It's like exactly as you say, our members will never get a bottle that hasn't been approved by the tasting panel. And if you think everything is approved, nothing could be further from the truth. Some are rejected. And what we will bottle is whiskies that will score a certain number in that panel, which we believe are right for bottling. And occasionally, I suppose you might say, I wonder if this particular whiskey would benefit from extra maturation in that sort of cask or this sort of cask, and it might go back into the warehouse on that basis. But our spirits team are very much in charge of that, even before it gets to the tasting panel. So, and there's some famous names in that tasting panel. It's a very important part of the society. It's a very important part of the provenance and assurance that we can give to members about the whiskey that we're putting in bottles. And they also, I should say, of course, so when you see the tasting notes on the bottle, that's the panel who've come up, and not one person will get all of those tasting notes. So don't think that when you've read these tasting notes, you get them all, because that's a group of people on the tasting panel. But sometimes the funny thing is the titles that are given, because it's supposed to be a bit of fun as well as a pointer towards flavour. So some of the titles now and again will give people a bit of a chuckle.
And everything that is and written, as you say, John, not every single note, you won't experience all of them, but certainly you have, your panel chair who will give the whiskey a name which is compiled from that tasting note, and the group will also assign a flavour profile to the bottling. So it's kind of a majority rules. Jack, have you guys got a tasting panel? How does it work in the world of craft beer?
Well, we are a team of 3 year-round, some additional seasonal staff that join us as well. So yeah, we have the joy of tasting beer, through its process of creation, but when it's at its kind of freshest, most vibrant flavor. So in terms of quality control for us, it's being really sure that we have some strong relationships with our suppliers. And first up, as I mentioned earlier, we source 100% Scottish grown barley for our beers. So the relationships we have, we understand where that barley is grown, who the farmers are. So there's a traceability element in there. So that's important to us. And likewise, we try to source as many of our brewing ingredients wherever we can from within the local area surrounding the brewery. So a couple of examples to that, and it maybe gives you a bit of an idea of both quality control as well as how Wasted Degrees approaches flavour creation, but also business. So we make a really kind of conscious effort to either work with local farms to buy ingredients that they grow nearby us, or help them in a journey to enable them to grow the kind of ingredients that we're looking for. It's not a common thing in craft beer. Hops, for example, seldom grown in any real volume in the UK these days, and predominantly imported. So trying to be conscious both of quality, but also the impact that a pursuit of quality has on the planet. So one or two examples there. So we in Perthshire, the area is known for growing a lot of soft fruits, and quality control. This is probably a kind of story of contrast. when raspberries, for example, are rejected by the supermarkets for being cosmetically imperfect, so that's a quality control thing through their lens, we as a brewery wrap our arms around those baskets of raspberries and brew with them. Perfectly good fruits. They might not be the most glamorous looking things, but hey, they're getting mashed up and thrown into a brew. So we look at quality control and through a couple of different angles, but it also helps us in our kind of pursuit of having the kind of lowest impact on food waste, but also that pursuit of flavour is so kind of dynamically connected with quality control there as well. So then any waste products we have, there's another quality control element from the local farms. They take the waste products from the brewery and put them to use and feed them to local livestock. So there's some really interesting parallels between brewing and distilling. A lot of very similar raw ingredients. 3 in particular that I can think of. Quality control, a really interesting thing. And being a small brewery and quite a nimble company, as is SMWS, you're much closer to the product. There's less process or people in the chain, so to speak.
Great. Well, we've had a couple of varied questions come in, so I'm going to dive into those and then let's try this whiskey. I'm very aware we're still on dram number 2 here. So one for you, John. Russell's asked, are all the casks stored in leaf?
No. In fact, there's only one stored in leaf, and that's in the bar. and it's a living cask. We were actually owned by Glenmorangie for about 11 years, from 2004-ish. And not long after Glenmorangie bought us, they were bought by Moët Hennessy, so we were owned by Moët Hennessy until 2015, when we bought ourselves back out again and are totally independent. And we have just had such a sweeping upward trajectory since then, in terms of the amount of casks that we have and the innovation that we're creating. We've actually got our casks out. We left Glenmorangie by agreement with a certain number of casks from the storage facility which we used when we were part of Glenmorangie, and we bought our own warehouse, which is in Hillington in Glasgow, and that's our main warehouse. We now have a new one which we're about to open because we need the space, in Uddingston near Glasgow, but we also store casks in a couple of dozen places around Scotland for the sake of spread, security, and that kind of thing. So we have casks all over the place, but none in Leith. The vault here in Leith is partly offices on the basement, but mainly a members. Well, apart from that, completely a members venue. We were talking earlier about Pip, and if you want to know more about the society, it's worth actually picking up his book, The Founder's Tale, which tells the whole story from start to modern times in terms of the society. And when we saw him last week, he also showed us another book. He reminded us of another book he'd written, the Scotch Whisky Directory, where he'd taken a whole load of different whiskies and used a bar chart to try and describe the flavours in each whiskey. And it's very useful because sometimes when you're trying to calculate, how much of that is fruity and how much is leathery or cereally or whatever, he'd done it by bar chart, and it's quite a helpful tool actually, and actually try to describe the flavours in whiskies, because it's not always that easy, is it? You have to think about it a bit and try and work out what it is you're experiencing in your palate and in your olfactory system. So sometimes it's good to look at one of those things, and it helps. The same way as our flavour profiles do. Yeah. If you haven't looked at them already, check our site for our flavour profile descriptions. In those, we have typical flavours that you might get in that particular profile, although every single one will be different. These are kind of largely typical flavours that you might be able to identify.
It can also really help you on outturn day, for example, because we often have about 30 releases each month, and those flavor profiles can really help you kind of narrow your choices down to find whatever character or style you're looking for. Each of the 12 colors corresponds to a different flavor profile. So you start with your kind of young and sprightly, going all the way through to your heavily peated. So make sure you take a look and find out which style you identify with. But make sure you try them all, because what looks good on paper, you might actually prefer a different flavor. So try them all.
Absolutely.
And with that, I think it's time to dive into this fruity prescription, which Russell's also asked if the tasting panel create the title, and they do. It's the tasting panel chair who comes up with the title based on the tasting notes that everyone has compiled.
I think it was Russell who said he was getting a bit medicinal in this one.
Mm.
I don't get it, but certainly I think the panel did get a bit medicinal in this, and it's very unusual for this distillery. This distillery is in the lowlands. I was brought up about 4 miles away from it, and it's one of the only, well, probably the only distillery in Scotland where everything, all the spirit, is triple distilled. So you would tend, and I've got a diagram somewhere of their actual distillation process, but it's the triple distillation should give a lighter, fruitier spirit. And it's funny, we're going to come to a distillery later where we can refer back to this, but medicinal quality in this whiskey is not usual, and it just shows what we can achieve with maturation in a single cask.
I think some of the medicinal nature could, like I'm noticing on the tasting notes, there's things like travel sweets and spearmint, and for me that's probably the most medicinal I get. I don't know about you, Jack.
Yeah, for me it manifests slightly differently. I get a sort of herbaceous, sort of Mediterranean wild fennel kind of vibe, particularly on the nose. So I think that comes through the palate as well. That's maybe the medicinal angle for me, that herbaceous. I think on the nose as well, it's got a smell of just a really nice old book. Plucked from a nice old library shelf.
Yeah, I kind of get that on the palate actually as well. Maybe licking an old book from a shelf. There we go with the strange tasting notes. I'm going to add a wee bit of water as well and see how it changes. Eboko says it tastes like an Irish whiskey to them.
That's that's the triple distillation that maybe made you think of that.
Well, I think
he says that. Yes.
Yeah. Jack, maybe you want to introduce the Galaxy IPA, and we can try this one again briefly with water, and then kind of move on to the beer and on to dram number 3.
Sure. So part of the process for selecting this beer for this particular dram was really not to distract from some of those kind of sweeter flavor components. So Galaxy IPA has quite a balanced bitterness. The hops is a single hop IPA, funnily enough named Galaxy. It's an Australian developed hop, and you might find on the palate there's a slight sweetness. There's a kind of pineapple lift on the palate there, so quite fresh, kind of cleansing to the palate. To some extent, at least for me, and we're finding out everyone's got different tasting notes, but for me, it's almost got that kind of sorbet vibe. So you have a freshness, you have a sweetness, but it really cleanses the palate. It doesn't linger too long. So that's the rationale behind that one. I think they kind of complement each other in that respect too, because this dram being slightly older has a slight depth to it as well. I think exploring that medicinal thing maybe talks to that somewhat. So yeah, fresh beer just for the complementary flavor.
No, definitely. And I'm really glad that we have this beer to pair with 2 drams to see how it interacts with dram number 2 and then how it plays with dram number 3. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting experiment, and I think it's a testament just to how you can explore flavor and kind of manage that journey yourself. describing what we're all tasting, what the tasting panel has experienced. There's no right or wrong answer here, and the same is true for whiskey and for beer. I think a couple of questions earlier around maybe how to enjoy the whiskey is, as John says, experiment, and likewise with the beer. The best drink is the drink you enjoy the way you like to drink it. So I'm certainly a fan, and I think from a craft beer perspective, and perhaps whiskey too, depending on your tastes, we often get asked questions about the kind of glass that you use. So thankfully I've picked this up and realized I am on brand, so ticking the box there. But ultimately we like to be able to get our nose in the glass. The flavor is not just what occurs on your taste buds, it's that whole olfactory kind of system experience. So particularly with with a light hoppy beer, there's a lot of aromatic elements in there too. And this one at 6.5% ABV will have slightly more of that alcohol hit that manifests as well in the kind of mouthfeel of the beer. So the other thing I get here, I'd be interested to know what other people think too. It's like kind of creaminess on the palate too.
No, definitely. Go ahead,
Well,
John.
lads, I was just going to say, this is a great comment by Ian. He thinks he's got a good palate, but the difficulty he finds is actually converting what he's tasting into actual words, to actual specific things. And I'll tell you something, Ian, you are not alone. You are not alone. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. You've got a couple of things working. You've got your orthonasal, your retronasal. You've got remember your olfactory system, final destination, your brain is the same part of your brain where your emotions and your memory are bedded. So often a tasting note can be indirect and remind you of something very particular in your life, which is why you get things like grandmother's kitchen at Christmas and that kind of thing. So Ian, I would say our spirit educator, Dr. Andy, we call him here, he was just saying at a tasting we did last year, you can get better at it by sheer practice. You can just try and experience things that you're smelling every day, tasting every day. But if you need a bit of a platform for a clue, there are a couple of things. There's the thing I mentioned earlier, and that is our flavour profile general descriptors. That'll give you a starting point, at least. And there's also the Scotch Whisky Research Institute Flavour Wheel, which is available online, which helps you take you through a journey. Is it sweet? Yes. Okay, what type of sweetness is it? Okay, what is it? Cooked sweet or is it raw? And that kind of journey through a wheel, which can actually get you practicing how to verbalize what it is you're actually using.
Yeah, and specifically, even if you think about it in terms of something's fruity, what kind of fruit is it? Is it a stone fruit or is it, something different? Even just breaking it down slowly like that can be really helpful.
Absolutely.
Great question here from Russell about beer temperature, Jack. So should all beer be served cold? Lager cold, IPA cold, stout not cold but not warm? Any pointers?
I'd go back to a point I made earlier around, it's your drink. You should be able to enjoy it the way that you prefer. I imagine the same is true for whiskey in that if you super chill a beer, there's a particular dark beer that's available quite readily on draft and in most bars throughout the world that has a regular variant and an extra cold variant. Personally, my taste buds tell me there's less going on when it's very cold. There's nothing better than a crisp, cool lager on a summer's day, that's for sure. And my preference would be to have that style of beer cold. IPA, I think, is an interesting one in that if it's served super chilled, you might not get so much of those aromatic elements. Cask beer, which was a particularly kind of dominant beer style before the current sort of craft beer movement, if you like. They tend to say that cellar temperature of around about 13 degrees was optimum for that beer. So certainly not cold, certainly not warm, but enough both to make sure that the flavour was present, but also that the beer remained fresh for a suitable length of time. Stouts, personally speaking, for me, and without diving into too much detail, it really depends on the sort of sub-genre or sub-style of stout. If it's a really kind of intricate barrel-aged stout, I would look to have it certainly not quite body temperature, but warm enough whereby the barrel components could really come through both in flavour and taste and aroma. Not quite a clean-cut answer on that one, but certainly in terms of beer storage, beer, especially craft beer, I would 100% with every beer store that chilled to maintain the beer at its optimum freshness for the longest period of time.
And there you have it. I think that's a really good point to jump on to dram number 3 so that we can try it with the Galaxy IPA.
So this one's fruit alloy, yeah?
Mm-hmm. This is from our sweet, fruity and mellow flavour profile. It's 19 years old, second fill ex-bourbon barrel and bottled at 57% ABV.
Now, this is incredibly interesting, even geographically.
Indeed.
The one that I mentioned that we've just had, the number 5, I said was in the Lowlands, did I not? And if you drive out of Glasgow on the Great Western Road towards one of Scotland's most famous lochs, Loch Lomond, a few miles past the distillery in the Lowlands, you hit a bump in the road. You think, goodness, what's that? Why are they having a speed bump on a main road? Well, it wasn't a speed bump. It was the Highland Line. You've just bumped over the Highland Line. And this distillery is a few miles down the road. It's in the Highlands. Okay. And this is the most complex distillery in the whole of Scotland. And it's so complex that we have 3 different malt whiskey numbers for it and 2 grain whiskey numbers. And this is one of the malt whiskey numbers, and it's distilled in a pot still with a straight neck, not a swan neck, a straight neck with plates, and it's got a cooling ring. And the reason I mentioned the triple distillation at the previous distillery is that this whole method of distillation is so unusual, but the idea was that you could obtain a triple distillation effect from double distillation because of the copper plates and the cooling ring. So the master distiller, this particular distiller, is a big friend of the society. He's done things for our ambassadors, educational things, and he's given us all the information. He's a fantastic fellow, and he says that the middle cut of when you distill a spirit, you get the four cut, the faints, and the middle cut is what you're taking to make your whiskey, and this is very high, between 90 and 80, and he talks about pears and apples and peaches being in the new make spirit. And he's very, very keen on emphasizing the fact that each type of distillation they have, I think they've got 11 stills of 4 completely different types. And each new make spirit is very different from the other new make spirits. And that's even before they decide what they're going to do with the casks. So we have got the spirit from them and we've matured it and we've created this fantastic, I think, whiskey, one of my favourite distilleries, really. And it's amazing how you can get attached. When you talk about aromas and flavours, you can become attached to a place and distillery because of the people and the experience you have with it. So any of you who have visited Scotland and Scotch whisky distilleries will know exactly what I'm talking about. And I know there are many of you all around the world that I've met who are dying to come and visit Scotland and our distilleries And when you do come, you will no doubt leave and you'll have a favourite in your heart. Okay. So let's try this one. There, David Campbell said, the pleasure of a guided tour. There you go. He knows the one I'm talking about.
He does. And I will say, of all of the recommendations of the whiskies that are coming, not to give a spoiler, but this one actually is still available. So
oh, fantastic. Put me down for a bottle, Mads. I'll pay for it tomorrow. This is just lovely, isn't it? It's lovely.
It's really estery. I think with the IPA, there's a lot going on that I'm really enjoying.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of kind of common soft fruit esters, that really, not quite grassy, but a sweet kind of vegetal element in there for me. John, absolutely pears.
Absolutely.
Really juicy.
I'll take something else. The master distiller there, he and I and Dr. Andy, who I mentioned before, are outstanding for a meeting and a dram or two in their Bath Street venue in Glasgow. So now that we seem to be getting back to normal, that's going to happen very soon. If he's watching, look forward to that.
And what do you think, Jack, in terms of, do you maybe want to talk a bit about pairing the Galaxy with this one and why you thought to do that?
Sure. So for me, certainly for my palate, this dram has a lot of kind of cut through. So there's some quite kind of sharp, sweet notes in there for me. And going back to an earlier comment around this like kind of creamy qualities in this IPA and the pineapple elements, I think that pairs quite well with the strength of alcohol in this dram, so 57%. So there's almost a kind of soothing element between the IPA and the dram. But the pineapple piece really, for me, complements that pear and that estery element that we've mentioned before. So yeah, trying to kind of complement one another. A few minty notes in there for me, and I see in some of the tasting notes from the panel too. So almost enough not to create something that's a bit sort of disorganized, but really to try and complement some of those bigger flavor elements in there.
Yeah, and in terms of water, not water, what do you think? I'm going to try it with a little bit of water just to see.
Sadly, I got carried away with just having beer instead of water in my whiskey. That's a very different approach and leads to quite a short night out in my experience.
I think in this society, we use numbers for the distillery and the cask. There's a reason for that. Every member who's been around for a while will know what that is. It's to allow our members to come to the whiskey with no preconceptions and think this might be different from the name of the distillery if it was on the bottle. But I did already mention the name of this distillery, because I said that as you went out on the Great Western Road towards Loch Lomond, and this is Loch Lomond Distillery, and if you look at our on our YouTube SMWS silver screen, you will actually see a tasting that we did with Loch Lomond and the Master Distiller Michael Henry. Wonderful experience, by the way, if you want to look at it, because it does give you an idea of the wide variety of and therefore whiskies that they can produce. It's almost like a Japanese distillery. In Japan, each distillery tends to do as much as it can in its own right, so it doesn't have to ask for anything from any other distillery. Whereas the history of Scotch is about people swapping their spirits with each other for each of their blends. But this distillery was kind of set up to be able to do everything on its own. And there's a fascinating story in that their single grain is only single grain because they did it in a column still. It was actually malted barley that they distilled. The Scotch Whisky Association rules don't allow them to call it single malt because it was distilled in a column still. So by all means, get yourself a bottle of that and see what you think.
Challenge accepted.
Challenge accepted. I think there's going to be a run on this one. So A Boko says, reminds me of a classic 70 pineapple, papaya, apricot, delicious. Russell is saying that he really likes the name and he hopes that within the SMWS we have an annual competition for the best name, as it's currently a fave. We don't have an annual competition, but that's a great suggestion. I'm gonna suggest that we do that. And then great comment as well from David Campbell. The master blender you speak of, who you know is Irish, learned his trade at Bushmills only a few miles from where I now live.
Yes, David, he is Irish, but he kind of regards himself as a bit of a Glaswegian now.
And Dean's saying it's a fantastic pairing. And I added a bit of water. I kind of wish I hadn't, but you know, sometimes you win some, you lose some. How are we feeling about this jam? I think I'm just about ready to move on to the next one and talk about our next beer as well,
Sure.
the Kveik, which is quite difficult to say, Jack.
I find perhaps in sort of a similar vein as tasting notes, these things become much more colourful and creative once you've had a few drams or sips of beer. So Kveik, call it what you will. A Norwegian yeast. So that's where the name of this beer comes from. And it creates a really kind of silky, luxurious, chewy, some might say, kind of thick body to the beer. So quite a lot going on in terms of mouthfeel. Those familiar with craft beer might have drunk some milkshake IPAs in the past. And those beers use lactose as an ingredient in the recipe to create a very similar body. Whereas we, in this instance, have used yeast. And yeast in craft beer production is absolutely huge. You can start with some phenomenal, raw materials, your grain bill, your hops, but yeast is fundamental to flavor creation in craft beer. You could have the same recipe and interchange different yeasts, and you would come up with a quite markedly different beer. So, be it kind of floral elements, bitter elements, sweet elements, there's so much to explore in that journey of flavor creation and recipe development. And again, a reason why we only tend to brew things once, because that experience of exploring flavor is both interesting as producers, but also to the people that enjoy our beers as well. It's ever changing. So as I say, this particular beer, here's some ASMR sound effects for everyone. The yeast is an absolutely core component of the experiential kind of aspect to this beer. Otherwise, flavor-wise, again, kind of low in bitterness. It's a hazy beer. It's a naturally hazy beer. Those who may be less familiar with craft beer, but more familiar with cask ale. In the cask ale world, traditionally, it was, in my opinion, mistakenly considered that a cloudy beer was a bad beer. That's certainly not true unless the beer is off. But in craft beer, cloudy beer is embraced. It's a very much kind of natural product. This can, should you leave it for any length of time, will not clear on its own. That's part of the recipe of the beer, and again, an influence of yeast and other ingredients in that beer. So in terms of the pairing here, so the whiskey is slightly younger whiskey than a couple of drams prior. So something to add, again, some body, potentially some richness, depending on your own palate, to really contrast with that slightly more kind of exciting younger whiskey. And I think that younger age statement there is quite an interesting one to pair with a beer, particularly a light beer like this. They don't confuse each other, which I think is another important thing whenever you're maybe going off piste and trying something new like this. If you've never tried a half and a half or a Boilermaker, if you're over the pond, beer and whiskey pairing.
Absolutely. And I think the really interesting thing about this pairing is actually you've got an interesting yeast type and you've also got an interesting cask type. I'm going to probably not pronounce it correctly, but the Koseka It's a wine cask for this whiskey. And we've actually got our spirits educator. He's just put in a wee comment there. Dr. Andy is watching, or at the very least listening. He's with Connus, and they're on their way to a gig. So cheers, Dr. Andy. Also a great comment there from Ian, who said he's been a new member for 3 weeks. He's heard from friends that they know the distilleries, doesn't think he wants to know just yet. Happy learning, and got a lot of papaya in that last dram. I think there's two approaches. I mean, obviously we have our naming system, which I'm sure John can tell us a bit more about. But really everything we do is about flavor. So focus on finding the flavors that you enjoy first. And if you want to know what the distillery is after that, then have a look. But go flavor first.
Yes, I think back in the, I've been a member for a very long time. I'm probably a bit older than most of the people listening tonight. But my membership number is only 3 digits, for example. But back in the early days, despite the fact that we'd started off with Glenfarclas and the agreement that we'd use a number and that kind of thing, in our newsletters to members, Pip talked fairly openly about which distilleries were involved with each number. And I think that society developed as it's still developing. I mean, it's a moving, growing thing. And we got to a point where as people started to appreciate it more and more, we thought, well, if they come to it with no preconceptions, they'll then maybe discover whiskies that they didn't think they were going to like and that kind of thing. That's how it developed. We know that many of our members check the number on the internet as soon as they get a bottle or buy a dram, and we know some don't. Ian was saying, for example, that he's going to try and leave it alone for a while until he develops his palate, and that's a great idea, you know. And when you're together with other members, Ian, you might find it difficult because other members will want to tell you which distillery it is, because some have got that kind of mindset. So there's no rules about this society. It's how you want to play it, you know. We've given the members every opportunity to either know or not to know. So it's really up to yourself. But the most important thing is it's about you experiencing the flavour. And I've seen many, many times members taking a whiskey, enjoying it, and then finding out what the distillery is and being completely amazed because they didn't think they liked the whiskey from that distillery.
I think personally as well, speaking as a member of SMWS for quite some years as well, John, I'm not comparing our ages here, maybe not quite as many years as yourself. But you know, from my perspective, I've actually, it's slightly geeky of me, but here we go. I've kept a note of virtually every SMWS bottle I've ever purchased, and for me, I'm really not interested in distillery code, but each to their own. For me, it's more just about exploring those individual casks, because unlike distillery branded bottles, every single bottle or every single cask that we produce, or as a society, is completely different, and doesn't necessarily conform to your previous experience of those casks. So certainly from my experience of whiskey tasting over the sort of 10 plus years I've been a member, less important for me. I think what is important, or rather what interests me maybe a little bit more.
Jack, that's absolutely spot on, and that is Pip's legacy. Pip's legacy to our membership, but also to the rest of the industry, because we led the way in that single cask single malt. We know there's lots of other people doing it now, but Pip, that man with that vision and ambition, created this platform for us to be able to do that, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that people who bottle single casks, other than us, tell you which distillery it is. So our process is our numbering system is pretty iconic around the world. It's a very, very individual thing, and it's there for a reason. And our members understand that reasoning, and they appear to like it.
Yeah, I like the exploration through the different, well, the numbers after the decimal point. You might have the same distillery, but you might, in some cases, see a progression of age. They might be the same type of cask, or they might even indeed be the same age. They could have been distilled on the same day, but you find such difference in those products, and that's what interests me.
That's exactly right. And what we have done over the years, we bottled similar casks, distilled on the same day, but matured in different types of casks. And it just allows people to understand where flavours come from. And another thing which I know Greg Dillon of Great Drams quoted me in his book on this, but people think that when they're on a whisky journey, Scotch Malt Whisky Society, single cask, single malt is something they would graduate to after they've tried other proprietary whiskies. And I think, well, no, I don't think so. I think it should be the other way around. If you want to understand the flavours that different types of wood provide, then we're better to start in the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. Then when you go to a proprietary whisky, which is a mix of different types of cask, and they tell you on the bottle, you can better understand where the different flavours in the glass come from. So I actually think that before you should drink a glass of whisky ever when you're 18, you should have to join the Scotch Malt Whisky Society.
I'll drink to that, John. That sounds good.
Well, I think your point, John, is that wherever you are on your whiskey journey, there's a place for you within the society.
Yes,
as Jack said, you might try whiskies that are from the same distillery, same age. They might be different flavor profiles,
yes,
and
yes,
doing
absolutely.
those kinds of vertical tastings is great, actually, because you kind of you can think about flavor, you can talk about flavor, you can discuss why you like it, why you don't like it, and that's what the society is all about.
That's
Bringing everyone together to talk about these drams and to talk about their enjoyment of them.
Absolutely.
So cheers to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
If I can get my beer geek on, and again, sorry, back to the subject of yeast, I see Russell's comment there about La Chouffe and yeast strains there, and how to manage yeast. The Belgians have their style absolutely nailed. Yeast is such a core component, and often breweries, particularly really historical breweries, and I'm sure the same would be true of some distilleries too, have their own sort of proprietary strain of yeast that's very carefully managed in a very thorough sort of scientific process, because they understand where that flavor, their kind of historic, really well understood and sought after flavors coming from in that yeast process. As for magnetic stirrers, Russell, really beyond me. I'll be completely honest. But I'd be interested, John, if you've got any kind of thoughts or insights on the sort of exploration of yeast and distillation. I don't know if that's something that's really explored much at all.
Jack, the Scotch whisky industry at the moment is such a whirlpool of debate about flavour. The new distilleries, the new craft distilleries, are working their way through sometimes old heritage strains of barley to say that we're giving more flavour. Remember that what is often been said is that the pursuit of yield during the 20th century was at the expense of flavour. Now, what is true is that during the 20th century, the average yield in the Scotch whisky industry went up by 50%. Okay, because of the different strains of barley that were used. It's almost exactly 50%. Okay, so what the new craft distilleries and what some of the people who love the old whiskies are saying is that no, we sacrifice flavour. Let's try and go back to that. And then a company like Diageo will tell you take a strain of barley and you do all that stuff to it during the process. You boil it and mash it and boil it again and expect it to make a difference in flavour at the end. And then you get experiments at Brewery, showing you the same barley grown in different places or different barleys grown in the same field and how that affects flavour. We talked to Dr. Andy, invited Dr. Francis Jack from SWRI to talk to a bunch of ambassadors in the vaults last week, and Dr. Francis Jack was kind of on the side of the barley probably doesn't make that much of a difference. But here we are with companies, new distilleries setting up and saying that it does make a big difference. So the wonderful thing I think, Jack and Mads, about it is that science doesn't have all of the answers. And the day that they do have all the answers, perhaps some of the romance will have gone out of it, you know? So I would just say that, you know, Dr. Andy, our spirit certificate, who's on the line now, I mean, he will tell you that, I mean, there's so much is said about Scotch whisky production, which actually isn't scientifically proven or correct, and so much we still have to learn. That's fascinating. And the Scottish Malt Whisky Society is at the forefront of all of that.
I'm muted there. It's always about trying new whiskies as well. I mean, like this one that we have here, our fourth jam of the evening. It's a really interesting one, as I said already before, in terms of the cask. I'm wondering kind of what everyone's getting from it. To me, it's beautifully sweet on the nose, but again, it's a cask type that we don't see very often. It's quite a young whiskey, 59.8% ABV. And spicy and sweet, but completely different from the other spicy and sweet whiskey we had, which just shows you, you know, different distillery, same flavor profile, completely different experience.
I mean, I guess it's a good point, Mads, because there's probably 200 flavor profiles, but our panel has to try and give our members an indication of the. And we also, and as I said before, we also give the indications of the general types of flavors. So we try to give our members as big an idea as possible, and every month's outturn about what they might expect, you know. But a lot of our members just enjoy the experimentation and saying what they like, you know.
And Aboko said he's amazed that this is just 7 years of age, and I think it does nose like a much older whiskey.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the colour is a testament to the cask, I would say, in this case. You know, really comes across as quite an active cask that's really imparted a lot of both colour and flavour. Texturally, for me, this is a really interesting dram, and yeah, I think that point's absolutely spot on. It really stands up against some of those older whiskies, for sure.
And this cask was actually supplied directly by our winemaker partners in Jerez. So they're ninth generation family winemakers, Jimenez Spinola, and they only grow PX grapes. And Cosecha, it's quite an unusual style of wine. It's lighter and a bit more fresh and fruity than your kind of typical sweet sherry-rich wines. So think about more like peaches and apricots rather than raisins and sultanas.
And back to the quality control piece, I think that knowledge of where that cask has come from is really interesting too. And that you know, you can trace that back to how that cask has been handled and looked after, because you know, no doubt these things last for a long time. But I think, you know, that relationship, like the relationship we have with our suppliers at the brewery, it's almost a, you know, it adds a lot of story for sure behind the dram, but that quality piece there is certainly not something I've seen a great deal of elsewhere. So kind of reassuring, I suppose, perhaps if you're on the beginning of your journey, or like I was 10 plus years ago, really rather clueless. I knew I enjoyed whiskey, but I think, yeah, again, speaking as a member, that the journey of education to me was important too. And I know, Madge, you mentioned Unfiltered earlier on. I'm a regular sort of dipping into that online and the paper copy as well. That's been really valuable from my perspective.
And I think Russell actually mentioned it earlier, our podcasts. So we have a podcast, Whisky Talk, which features everything from industry insider to interviews to also a recent malts and music special series with BBC radio DJ Vic Galloway. So make sure you check the podcasts out, because it's quite good to listen to if you can't spend the time reading the magazine, but also set some time aside and read the magazine, because there's a lot of information there.
I think that's an extremely important point, Mads, about what makes Scotch Malt Whisky Society different. It's not just the whisky that we supply, it's that whole round of information and education and fun that a member can avail himself or herself of, you know. It's I think I was just saying to someone today that if you really are on a whisky journey and you want to learn about distilleries and about whisky generally and what the differences in product, then what better place than a society, because it's all there online via the Unfiltered and the podcasts and all the rest of it, you know. Fantastic online tastings, live tastings, different types of tastings, you know, tastings.
And I think that's the thing. It's about making it approachable as well. I mean, so often there's a lot of jargon that's thrown around, and all you need to say is this whiskey tastes like X. You know, it tastes like raisins, or it tastes like crackers. Those are two really boring tasting notes. But you know, if you can say that, you're already talking about the whiskey, and that's one of the most important things at society.
Absolutely. Spot on.
And I must say, I like the artwork on this one as well.
Well, this was also quite a good cask story, because it was actually selected by our European brand ambassadors. So they all sat down and tried it. I think they tried a couple of different casks, and this was the one they selected and wrote the tasting note for. And it was inspired by a famous song. I'm going to let our audience guess which one. And it was named by Connus, who was actually tuning in there earlier with Dr. Andy.
For those that are maybe contrasting the dram with the beer, I think the spicy and sweet, if I'm right in saying, flavor profile on this one, I find that the beer helps to temper that. You know, if your palate's maybe particularly sensitive to this flavor profile, I think the job of the yeast and the kind of body of this beer, as well as the kind of balanced bitterness in the beer as well, really helps to kind of make the dram, as I say, if it's not usually your cup of tea, perhaps more approachable. But you know, if it is a favourite flavour profile for any of you out there, it's actually my favourite flavour profile of the 12. It actually opens up a few of those kind of darker fruit notes, getting some plums in there myself. Be interested to hear what other people watching are experiencing from this combination too.
Yeah, I would echo that, plums. It certainly brings out a lot of sweetness for me, the two of them together. And the dram is so sweet that I didn't think I could get more sweetness from it, but it's a different type of sweetness.
See, Bocco's raised a good point there about reading the tasting notes. I always say, Bocco, there's two ways of tasting our whiskey. First one is to read the tasting note and then sip the whiskey, in which case what you've done in your brain is that you're trying to establish some of the flavours that you've just read about. The other way to do it is to see what you get from it and then look at the tasting note. Much more fun, and you'll then open your mind and potentially get things which the tasting panel haven't established. More fun.
That element of surprise.
Yes.
So it's maybe not going to be surprising, but I'm going to suggest that we try the final dram of the evening and the final pairing of the evening, which is it's the 24.153 Midsummer Night's Dream and the Wasted Degrees Stout, quite a different color from the previous beers as well. Actually, the whiskey as well is quite a different color.
Yeah, beautiful, isn't it?
Both, I think they look very beautiful next to one another.
This is a very old family-owned distillery, and not family-owned anymore, you know, but a very, very big name in the whiskey industry, for Speyside.
Jack, do you want to talk a wee bit about the stout first, and then we can try the whiskey?
Sure. So yeah, much more kind of as you can certainly tell by the color of this one, more kind of roasted malts in amongst there. So on the palate, a little bit more, certainly a little bit more chocolate, potentially coffee, just towards the side of the tongues. That slight bitterness there. You could interpret some of it as slightly smoky, although unlike a whiskey, this isn't involving a kind of smoked malt on the mash bill. And yeah, on the nose, slightly more kind of biscuit sweets rather than fruity sweets. So again, really emphasizing the grain element in here, in contrast to the other beers we've had this evening. Hops really not the top of the agenda in this recipe. It's really about emphasizing the darker roasty notes from the grain bill here. And this stout, mouthfeel wise, it's slightly lighter. Just a small amount of oats in the mash bill there, just add a slight bit of body. And yeah, more sessionable stout, so 4.4%. So certainly a really interesting one to pair with a dram like this to contrast some kind of roasty characteristics with some of the darker, sweeter fruit elements in the dram.
I really enjoy stouts, and I think just because there's almost sometimes a coffee, chocolatey element to them, and it's something that I think will pair very, very well with this dram once we get around to trying it. Great comment there from Russ, who said that on the note about music, as well as keeping tasting notes, he keeps track of what he's listening to when he's dramming and enjoying whiskey. So it's all the senses plus company, which is it's a great idea. I might have to steal that one for myself.
It's a great comment, Russell. I was actually drinking. I had a bottle of SMWS 121 on my shelf last year, and I already drank half of it, and I thought it was a nice whiskey. And one evening, I was sitting and I was listening to a certain piece of music, and I poured this dram again, and I thought, my goodness, this is the best dram I've had this year. And why did I think that when I was drinking it before, when I drank half of the bottle before? And different moments, different times can have you appreciating whiskey completely differently. You can actually have a whiskey on a Tuesday evening and think one thing, and on a Thursday evening think something else. And that's the wonder of it. That's the wonder of it. It's fantastic. And this one is one of our special small batch cask bottles. So we have a batch of casks and we move it into different types of casks. A bit of an innovation for us. This is a bit special. This is an Oloroso sherry cask matured. Is that right? Yeah. First fill hogshead, ex-Spanish oak Oloroso. I could tell just by smelling it. And just look at the colour of that one. Fantastic. I think this is another one that demonstrates the expertise of our spirits team and the innovation we're bringing to the flavour.
I think that's an interesting question that Russell's just brought up there around do dark beers or stouts go well with similar coloured whiskey? I think certainly in this example, yeah, absolutely. I'd be fascinated, and we may not have time this evening to do that, but to go back through to some of these other drams to explore that. If anything, it gives a bit of contrast. Personally speaking, I from my own experience with society whiskey, I like pairing darker beers with some of the spicy and sweet or the spicy and dry flavor profiles, because they often help to either complement or challenge each other. Potentially, depending on the beer, but certainly for a stout, I would possibly avoid sort of juicy oak and vanilla. They may kind of overemphasize some of those sweeter, richer flavors. It might not be to your liking. But again, to some of those earlier points, it really just comes down to the individual palate. But yeah, for me, I think it works quite well with the spicy profiles.
I think it's, for me, the whiskey and the beer here, it's I don't want to say it's entirely Christmassy, but it's headed in that direction.
Yes. Yeah. Definitely roasted walnuts in there, isn't there?
Yeah, quite nutty.
A touch of cinnamon as well.
To your earlier point, John, around the olfactory system and where it makes its way to your brain and that kind of emotional part of your brain, that it absolutely ties in with listening to music, enjoying a dram with a meal, for example.
Absolutely.
The company you have around, indeed, even your own company from time to time. I think that there's that kind of horrible and I think quite incorrect cliche of that sort of solitary dram on your own. It can actually be quite a joyful experience because you will discover things because you have the headspace to explore those drams too. So yeah, it doesn't have to be a dark winter's night to enjoy a stout and a sherry finished dram.
A couple of our members down where in the south of England who have their own SMWS tastings, at home, and I get invited, and they're great evenings, and it's just jolly and people joining in and having their own views and telling stories. It's great. It's fantastic. That's the way it should be done. That's, in fact, the history and the culture of Scotch whisky.
And I would say as well, for anyone out there who is having a get-together with friends, or you're doing something special with some of your SMWS drams, drop us a message on social media, tell us about it. We love to feature member stories in Unfiltered, and so we're always up for hearing what kind of creative tastings you're organising at home, and what drams you're sharing. And I think we had a great question for you, Jack, actually, from David Campbell, saying there's no stout in your shop. Has it all gone?
So I was actually just noting your name down there, David, so we could come back to you. So yes, stout has gone. So the last of it has gone out with these packs. And your heart will sink when I say this, but bear with me, it will get better. So we tend only to brew our recipes once, and when it's gone, it's gone forever. We will bring stouts back. It's a really popular beer style recipe. Will always be different. As I say, it keeps it interesting for us. And most likely in a few weeks' time, we'll be brewing some more stouts, and quite an interesting, innovative product that I don't want to give too much away to spoil the surprise, but we're very fortunate at Wasted Degrees. We're sited within sort of a stone's throw of Blair Castle, where those that are familiar with whisky will know the Keepers of the Quake gatherings occur. A very historic building indeed. The location of one of the few private armies in Europe, certainly the only private army in the UK, is sited at that castle. So an incredible amount of history. And we had a meeting there with the archivist of the castle, who was very kind with her time, Karen, and shared with us a lot of history of drink at the castle that has been enjoyed over the last however many 100 years, including a document that dated back to the early 1100s. So some interesting projects coming along the track that relate directly to that, and specifically on stout as well. You'll be pleased to hear. So keep your eyes peeled and follow the brewery on Facebook and Instagram to make sure you don't miss that. Everything we do is small batch limited edition. But in the slightly nearer term, we have a project underway with the vaults. So Gregor, the manager at the vaults, and his team have been in conversation with us at the brewery, and we have quite an exciting collaboration coming up in the next few months, where we at the brewery have created a stout that is currently seasoning in one of the living casks. If you're familiar with the vaults, there's a cask of whiskey usually present on the bar that you can bottle yourself. So we received a cask from the vaults that was previously a first fill Oloroso, so a quarter cask, roughly 50 litres, So we've created quite a special, unique stout that is sitting in the brewery just mere miles from where I'm sitting just now, carefully aging, and we're patiently waiting for a couple of months until we think that stout's ready. We'll package that up, and the cask will get sent back down to the world's most colourful whiskey club venue in Leith, and Gregor and the team will then take that effectively beer seasoned Oloroso cask and fill it with a society whiskey to age on the bar at the vaults. And towards the end of June, we'll get together to have a tasting. So if you're fortunate enough to be nearby the vaults, you'll get the opportunity in due course. You'll hear more information in the following weeks and months as to how you can get involved in that. So yeah, a barrel-aged stout from a society barrel that previously held society whiskey, and then the whiskey that was subsequently finished in that stout barrel. So some really exciting stuff coming up. So yeah, please do keep kind of tuned in to both the society and the brewery's social media pages for more information on that.
All that talk, Mr. Jack Lowe, about everything being a one-off. Am I not going to be able to get any more of that chili porter?
Bide your time. There's always rules to be broken. And much like it's very healthy to challenge convention and challenge rules, John. Sure. So as an old boss of mine used to say, feedback's a gift. Happy to receive that kind of feedback. And
that was wonderful. I loved that.
You beat me to it, John. I was going to say the Chipotle Porter was one of my favorites. It was one of the first. It was actually one of the first Wasted Degrees beers I tried. And I wasn't a fan of that style of beer initially, but that really won me over.
It's oddly, and you'll probably find this reassuring, John, it is one of the few, if not the only beer that the brewery has ever rebrewed because it's so popular. So David, back to you. If you're keen on a dark beer from Wasted Degrees, I'd very much encourage you to check out the Chipotle Porter. So, similar kind of grain bill to the stout, but brewed with equal parts cocoa nibs for kind of chocolate influence and a sweetness and body, but also chipotle chilies. So by no means a spicy beer. That's not the point, and that's not how it manifests in the experience and flavor. But chipotle chilies, smoky characteristic coming from them. So a kind of fleshy fruit forward dark beer with that smoky characteristic. It'd be a really interesting one, and I'd be fascinated, David, ping us a message on Facebook or wherever you get involved on social media. I'd be really interested to know what kind of dram you pair that with from SMWS. That'd be fascinating.
And we've had quite a different question from Richard. How are you finding English whiskey is going today? So I'm throwing that out there. John, Jack, anyone who wants to.
Well, I remember back in 2009, I think it was, I did a tasting in St Andrew's Day in Birmingham, and we invited David Fitt along from the St George's English Whiskey Company, and he only had 18-month-old spirit at the time, and we shared it with the audience, and they were all enjoyed it. Thought it was full of promise. At that time, they were the first English whiskey distillery in 120 years or something like that, and now it's burgeoning as it is in other countries around the world. And I think Dan Zohr at Cotswold Distillery is trying to lead a movement to try and get a geographical indication stamp for English whiskey. So we'll see how that goes. There's no doubt that in England they're making some good whiskey. I think Bimber have now opened a second distillery, I think, in Scotland, Dunfermline. So yes. There is no reason why they can't make whiskey in other countries. It's just that, I guess Scotch is the world leader because of the history, the culture, and the attachment of Scotch to the country and all that. But certainly, yeah. I mean, I've made good friends of the people at St George's since then. I've enjoyed their whiskey. We've bottled some of it.
And I would say on that point, if you're wanting more about English whiskey, we have a couple of podcasts on Whisky Talk about it. There's also quite an extensive article in Unfiltered about English whiskey. I think it was from the last year or so. So be sure to check that out, because there's a lot there, and there's probably a lot more coming as well.
And there's a program, a 3-part whiskey program you might still be able to find on the internet, just called Whisky. It's led by the actor David. His name escapes me. But it's a 3-part series just on whiskey around the world. And there's an interview with Andrew Nelstrop from George's Whisky Company on that, where he talks about what he was trying to achieve. And I know Dan Zohr from Cotswolds pretty well. And he's come to a few whiskey clubs I'm a member of to tastings. A great chap. He's got a terrific story to tell, actually, Dan Zohr, about how it all started for him. So, yes.
Yeah.
I would also encourage people, and again, personal recommendation from my experience of drinking these whiskies is whenever you get the opportunity to try Distillery 128, so that's Welsh whiskey. I may be slightly biased because my wife, who happens to be Welsh, is sitting about 12 feet.
She's going to shoot you if you don't say that. Yeah.
That's it, I know, yeah. Gotta get my flag out. One of my favourite society drams, absolutely superb. A very different still used in that distillery too. So again, like all of the distilleries we've tried tonight, and the beer as well, there's so many different nuanced elements to explore, and a great deal of them influence that flavour creation and the process.
And Jack, I don't mind saying that's Penderyn, of course, because we did a tasting online on YouTube
last March,
last year. So we featured 128. So yeah.
Ian's asking about the last whiskey, saying it can't be Speyside. It is a Speyside whiskey, Ian. I can confirm it.
Why do you say that, Ian?
Am I right in saying Speyside technically part of Highlands region overall? Is that?
Yeah. It's a kind of region within a region, really. Yeah.
I just wondered if that was maybe Ian's query on that one.
Sure.
We'll wait for Ian to come back on that. We have had some folks putting in their top drams for the evening. So if you haven't told us which one was your favorite yet, please do tell us which beer. Was it the beer that we matched? Was it a different beer? Be keen to know. And Ian said it's.
I see. Yeah. Okay. That's because of the way in that we have matured it. We've given it some extra quality there that perhaps you may not normally expect, perhaps.
Russell's really enjoying the stout and the whiskey.
Me too. I can see these drinks going on slightly longer after this section this evening.
Yes. No, as I said earlier, feel free, just because the tasting's ending doesn't mean you need to finish the drams. Sit there, maybe fire on some music, and try them all and enjoy them.
And you never know, Jack. Something last 10 minutes, I may get a knock on the door. And somebody say, "Here's your parcel, Mr. McChain."
Well, you never know. David it would be great comic timing. David saying that his favorite is the 24. Richard likes the 1.245. John, Jack, which dram and which beer? Is it the same dram? Is it the same beer? And then we'll wrap it up. And
I must say I'm a dark beer fan. I'm one of those people that will drink dark beer year round. Back to the question earlier on about sort of serving temperature. Any temperature is fine for me. Cooler in the summer, but certainly the stout and the last dram really interesting combination. I actually quite enjoyed the kind of leathery element of that one. That probably says more about my palate.
Andrew was there, the production chap. Is there a question at some point there about Northern Ireland whiskies?
It was David saying that we should try some of the new Irish whiskies. Which it's a good tip.
It's interesting, David, that if you go back in history, there was the first whiskey region was probably Dalriada, which was Northern Ireland and the Hebrides combined. You look back in history at that. And in fact, there's about to be a new distillery project in Campbelltown called Dalriada. Dalriada was a combination of the Celtic peoples of Northern Ireland and the Hebrides. And actually, we had a manager of our venue in London who went on to start a business called High Sea Spirits, where he was going to try and bring the history of that area, Dalriada, through in terms of tours around the Northern Ireland, which Mills it was then, and the Hebrideans. But I believe there's a few more Northern Ireland now, as you've referred to. Fascinating history.
Definitely. And John, did you have a favourite whiskey of the evening?
Yes, my favourite was 112.
112.
Yeah.
I have to say, the last time I tried these whiskies, I was definitely Team Grain, because I was really persuaded and loved that. But Jack, the stout paired with the 24, that has just been a great discovery tonight. So that's my choice. And Ian has actually said his favorite beer was the Galaxy IPA, and he'd like a keg, please. And he preferred the last whiskey. So there you have it. But I think on that note, it's probably time for us to take our leave. So, gentlemen, thank you so much.
Just for 10 seconds.
Don, no, go for it.
I mentioned Compton Mackenzie at the beginning of the tasting, who wrote Whisky Galore. So if you know Whisky Galore, and if you've read the book, there is a toast at the end. It's a long story attached to it. I won't bother with the story. I'll just give you the toast. Ladies and gentlemen, love makes the world go round, but whiskey makes it go round a little faster. Slanjiva.
Slàinte, John. Slàinte, Jack. Thank you both for joining. On that note, there's plenty more to get involved in with the society, so keep an eye on smws.com/events and also on your emails, as there's lots of exciting things coming up. That's it for me for now. Good night and slàinte.